You see this happening now with Obama. He can't get anything through the Republican Congress, and so now he's issued a lot of executive orders in terms of the Environmental Protection Agency and immigration and so forth. I actually think that these are wrong, that these are abuses of power. This is what's gone on in Latin America, where presidents facing a legislative gridlock have basically tried to grab power for the executive, and you can't do that in our system. You can't do that in our system.
I'm very interested in the more general analysis you have of modern American government, or the problems of modern American government, which you call our situation today a vetocracy. We live in a new kind of government in which vetoes rule. What do you mean by that?
Well, vetocracy is a somewhat pejorative way of describing our checks and balances system. So the Founding Fathers, quite wisely created a constitutional system that was very suspicious of centralized power. And so we have a separation of powers on many different levels. We have federalism, we have a court that can overrule legislation. We divide power between two houses of Congress and a president. All of these are ways of blocking strong government action, they empower parts of the government to block action by the whole. And these vetoes have actually expanded in a non-constitutional way. So senatorial holds on executive branch appointments, the use of the filibuster, none of these are in the Constitution, but they're ways of minorities stopping majority action. I think that this system was made to work quite adequately through much of American history. But one thing that's happened in the last 20 or 30 years is first the polarization between the Republicans and the Democrats, so that there's almost no ideological overlap now between the parties. And then the second is the rise of extremely well-organized, well-funded interest groups. And between this, it's really gummed up the workings of government. So another example, the tax code. I think both Republicans and Democrats agree the corporate tax rate of 35% in the United States is too high. It's way above the average for the other, the rest of the industrialized world. But a lot of corporations don't pay that because they've negotiated special subsidies or tax breaks for themselves, which is why we've got a tax code that is in the thousands of pages. I think it's actually a disgrace. I mean, it's an example of what Tocqueville would call privilege rather than liberty. And we cannot get past this. We cannot lower the top rate and get rid of the subsidies, which would everybody agrees would be a much fairer system, because our system of vetoes allows all of these well-organized groups to stop things that are really not in a broader public interest. So that's the kind of, so again, the Republic is not going to collapse because of this tax code, but it is unfair, and it leads to very, skewed outcomes, and it, I think, in the long run, undermines the legitimacy of the system as a whole.
But how do you explain the fact that things do get done, sometimes big things, as, say, the 1986 tax reform bill under President Reagan, or even the passage of Obamacare under President Obama? I mean, the system of separation of powers was designed, of course, to weed out bad legislation and force reconsideration and better deliberation and so forth. Why should we think it's the system's fault?
Well, it isn't the system's fault. So it's the system colliding with these changes in society, which are the polarization and then the rise of these well-organized interest groups. If you just had the system and the two parties overlapped as they did, for much of the 20th century, so that's how you got the Reagan tax cuts and the New Deal and the Great Society and, all of these big pieces of legislation, then you can make the system work pretty effectively. And all the great presidents have been able to form these big coalitions that did cut across parties. But that doesn't exist right now in, in the two political parties, and we simply did not have, the kinds of money and interest group power in earlier phases of the Republic, and I think that's really the source of the problem.
No, it's fascinating to me how you've come around to your fellow Hegelian's point of view, Woodrow Wilson. Since really, and
Yeah.
you have some nice things to say about Wilson, who I think is a very intelligent and important scholar, as well as, of course, a politician. So I'm glad to see you're talking about Wilson, although I think we may have different
Yes.
points of view about him. But I mean, Wilson was making the same argument about the infirmity of the separation of powers system more than 100 years ago. And the argument was the same. Corporate power was too great. It was special interests were interfering and adding to the already sticky mechanism of separation of powers. And so we had gridlock or deadlock or whatever term you want to use, since the same criticism has been made over the past 100 years quite frequently. But Wilson thought that he had a solution for that, which we have been enjoying, if that's the right word, for a long time. And I wondered what you thought about that. I mean, he argued that we needed leadership and the ability of the president to sort of go over the heads of Congress and appeal and lead public opinion. He argued that we needed a separation between politics and administration so that a lot of these questions could be put aside and handled by experts and not subject to either democratic deliberation or especially to the conflictual form of it that the separation of powers brings about, and so forth. In other words, we were supposed to have solved this problem, at least by his lights, 100 years ago or so. It's interesting that the problem seems to recur in every generation, only to be somehow finagled past.
Well, so in a certain sense, I don't think the system can be solved in our presidential system or any presidential system. So you have to understand that I take this pretty broad comparative perspective, and as I've gotten older and watched these things work, it does seem to me that parliamentary systems tend to work better in many ways than presidential ones, for the following reason, that because you've separated the presidency and Congress and each have equal legitimacy, if you get deadlock between those two branches, one of two things happens. Either you get gridlock and stasis, or there's the threat of executive power, and you see this happening now with Obama. He can't get anything through the Republican Congress, and so now he's issued a lot of executive orders in terms of the Environmental Protection Agency and immigration and so forth. I actually think that these are wrong, that these are abuses of power. This is what's gone on in Latin America, where presidents facing a legislative gridlock have basically tried to grab power for the executive, and you can't do that in our system. You can't do that in our system, and so this is why I think that these problems are actually quite deeply rooted in the whole separation of powers right from the get-go. And I don't have a particular solution to that.
No, well, of course, that's Wilson's that was his preferred solution to overcome separation and make us into a more parliamentary form of government, which he gave up on when he realized that the necessary constitutional amendments could never be passed to make it effectual. But you're not the first or the last to make this criticism, I'm sure, of the separation of power system. But you do make it with great learning and distinction.
One thing, though, I would say, Charles, to my conservative friends, is that if you actually, all of these checks on power are generally favored by conservatives because it was an obstacle to the growth of big government. But now that we've got big government, it does seem to me that it's actually an obstacle to the reduction of the size of government. So if you think about something like entitlement reform, which we will have to do down the road, we will just have to confront this, that vetocratic system is going to be a huge obstacle to that, because in order to fix this problem, you're basically going to have to take away benefits from people or raise taxes or, more likely, some combination of the two, and every single one of those taxes or benefits taken away hits an interest group that is very powerful, well organized, and able to use the system to stop that from happening. And that's why I think, this system is not going to serve us well, as we face, I think, some of the fiscal challenges that we've got down the road.
Well, there's some truth in what you say, although I would say that points to a different problem of democratic accountability, as you call it. I mean, your choice of terms tends to confine the democratic element in politics, I mean, the role of public opinion, let's put it that way, in politics, to responding to blessing or not something that the government has done. It makes it, it reduces it to a responsiveness in a certain way, a democratic responsiveness. The people have to be consulted. But to I think, a lot of American sensibilities, it sounds like the people and the majesty of the people and of public opinion and of constitutional government sort of devoted to shaping public opinion in the long term is downplayed a little bit. You talk, I think you at least give the impression in these volumes that the quality of the state apparatus is in some ways the primary question. You need to have democratic accountability, you need to have rule of law, but it does tend to, your analysis tends to denigrate or to downgrade the Republican components of the government, you might say, the role of public opinion and of educating a public opinion about the dangers of, say, our coming fiscal crisis due to entitlements. That would then working through the separation of powers, bring about a necessarily deeper and more lasting political change. And that, I think, is probably the subject for another book by Frank Fukuyama. Thank you very much. Thank you for appearing on The American Mind. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.